Hello and welcome back to p1&2. This will be the reading of Chapter 5, Between Ghosts and Promises, Part 1 and Part 2 from After the Fall by an innocent with one name underscore reader. I think this whole chapter is going to be, the parts in this chapter is going to be shorter, so I'm going to do two groups of 2 and 2 for Chapter 5. Anyways, now on to the part. Chapter 5, Between Ghosts and Promises, Part 1. POV Midoriya. Are you sure you want to walk? Dick asked, stopping beside the cot. Midoriya nodded and pushing himself up by his knees. If I stay still, my head's going to explode. I need to see where I am. Wally shrugged, but a faint, sad half-smile escaped. Then you're getting the guided tour. It's not exactly the happiest trip in the world. It's not supposed to be happy, Dick replied, already moving ahead. It's for you to understand. Midoriya frowned. Understand what? What's left? And so they started walking. The silence in the back cave was almost sacred and heavy. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the dense presence of something that clung to every stone, every machine, as if the air itself had been soaked in stories and ghosts. The rhythmic echo of dripping water was lost in the depths, blending with the low hum of the servers and the distant drone of a ventilation system that seemed to breathe with the place. The metallic scent of aging steel mixed with the faint trace of old oil, grease, unsettled dust, the damp chill rising from the raw rock walls seeped into the bones, as if the cave itself wanted to remind anyone who entered that the world outside no longer existed as it once had. It was like walking through a mausoleum, not just one of technology, but of memories. Dick walked along the darkened terminals, his short cape swaying slightly with each step. Under the weak glow of the hanging lamps, his figure cast long, broken shadows against the jagged walls. With every step, he felt the weight of the place pressing down on his shoulders. Once this had been the heart of a network that connected heroes across the world. Now, it was the tomb of their era. Wally followed close behind, saying nothing. His gaze stayed low, not out of inattention, but as if his eyes were avoiding the weight of what the place represented. The variably audible drag of his footsteps betrayed a weariness that wasn't physical. Midoriya, still wearing the hospital pajamas, came last. His steps were careful, almost hesitant, as if he feared any noise might profane the space. Though his body was steady enough to walk, there was hesitation in the way he moved, not from pain, but from something that hurt more, the emptiness. The emptiness of everything left behind. Their footsteps echoed over the cold, metallic walkways. To the left, a massive control panel sat lifeless. Several loose cables hung like exposed veins, and on the table beside it, there was still a coffee mug, its contents dried into a crust at the bottom. No one had had the time or the will to clean it. Midoriya brushed his finger over the dusty surface of a workbench scattered with tools, a fallen wrench, scattered bolts. It looked as if someone had dropped everything and left in a hurry. He wondered if he should ask what had happened, but the heavy silence around him convinced him to keep his mouth shut. Farther ahead, one of the platform's lifts was stuck halfway, suspended in mid-air, holding a partially dismantled Batmobile. Missing parts, open panels, and a film of dust revealed how long it had been there. Wally averted his eyes from that car. He knew exactly which one it was and who had driven it last. The group passed a cracked glass wall, behind which the armory could be seen. Many shelves stood empty, and those still held weapons looked untouched for months. The internal lights flickered irregularly, as if the system itself was resisting its final shutdown. Midoriya felt crushed by the atmosphere. It wasn't just a hideout, it was a living memorial, and every object, every corner was an unmarked grave. Dick stopped before a raised circular platform, surrounded by terminals and projectors. "This is where the main table used to be." His voice was deep, but without emphasis, as if the act of remembering alone carried enough weight. Batman held meetings here with the core members of the League. Midoriya looked around, picturing the circle filled with legendary figures he knew only by name. Now, only 3 shadows moved through the ruins. "And now?" he began to ask, but the questions trailed off before it could leave his lips. Dick didn't answer, but he just kept walking towards the higher section of the cave, where a row of mannequins stood, now all empty. Missing uniforms, dust outlines where weapons had once hung. The place built for heroes, now only memories. Dick kept moving and Midoriya followed, still taking in every detail of this place that felt frozen in time. They climbed a narrow ramp and that led to a more elevated, isolated section of the cave. As they approached, the air seemed heavy, as if every step pulled them deeper into a memory that didn't want to be revisited. There, lined in silence, stood several combat mannequins. Some still wore intact uniforms, preserved like relics, others were bare. Only a hollow, dust-covered silhouette marking where a hero had once stood. Midoriya stopped when he noticed one mannequin, clean, dustless, without a suit, as if someone had cared for it recently. The pedestal gleamed under the soft light, standing alone. Dick stopped in front of it. "There's always someone left," he said without looking at anyone. Midoriya lifted his gaze. "What?" "In the stories," Dick continued, his tone distant. "There's always someone left to tell, to remember." Wally, walking behind them, crossed his arms and looked forward, as if trying to see something beyond the rocky ceiling. "Someone to carry the names of those who fell." Midoriya fixed his eyes on the pedestal, picturing what had been there. A black cave, a bat symbol, a cold mask, and he understood without needing to ask. "Bruce," Dick said, the name carrying a strange weight. "He didn't leave notes, he didn't leave final instructions, but I know what he'd expect from me." He paused for a moment. To get back up. To get back up. Wally gave a sad smile. He was always good with motivational words, huh? Dick shook his head, but smiled faintly in return. "No, he was terrible at it, but he showed it. He showed it through action." Midoriya lowered his eyes, taking a deep breath. Those words veiled in grief. It all felt too familiar, as if he could hear them in the voice of someone else who had lost everything, yet kept moving forward. All Might. The memory of the fallen symbol of peace pulled him back for a moment, the pain in his chest the same. "I lost everyone too," he said, his voice nearly breaking. Dick looked at him then, no longer with suspicion in his eyes, but with empathy. "Tell me about them," he said, "if you want." Midoriya hesitated for a moment. The fear that no one could understand gripped his chest. But here, in front of these two, in this cave built of loss, he felt that maybe he could be understood. "I was part of a school," he began. "A school for hero training. UA, we trained to protect people, to keep the peace. I had friends there, Uraraka, Ochako, Idatenya, Toroki Shoto, Bakugatsuki, Jiro Kyoka, and my mentor, All Might." Wally sat on a nearby workbench, listening closely. Dick remained standing, arms crossed, focused on the boy. We fought against a man named All for One, a villain who could steal quirks, powers, and use them as weapons. He destroyed everything. When we thought we had beaten him, he came back with Shigaraki. They wiped out almost the whole world. Not much was left. Midoriya drew a deep breath, eyes fixed on an empty point in space. And then I fought him again. It was hard. I lost hope of winning and tried something drastic, I guess. And after that, I ended up here. The silence lingered for a moment. Dick stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then I understand. Yes, then you understand. Midoriya nodded, squeezing his eyes shut to hold back tears. Yes, I understand. Wally let out a sigh. It still hurts like hell, doesn't it? It does, Midoriya replied. But if we're still here, then we have to make it count. Dick finished. The three of them stood there in silence once again. But now it was a different silence, not the silence of mourning, the silence of something beginning to rebuild. Maybe not hope, not yet, but companionship, a fragment of relief among the ruins. Dick looked at the two of them, then at the darkness of the cave. The bat cave was wounded, but still standing just like them. There's always someone left, he repeated, even if it's just us. And this time, no one disagreed. And now, moving on to Chapter 5, Between Ghosts and Promises, Part 2. Part 2, POV, Robin. Robin typed with precision, but the keystroke sounded muffled in the Batcave, as if even the noise was afraid to echo too loudly in that emptiness. Every command he entered produced a short burst of static, coming and going like the shadow breaths of a dying man. The air was cold, heavy, and the dampness from the stone walls seemed to cling to the skin. And the faint metallic scent mixed in the dust that had settled into the cracks of the tables. The main monitors displayed nothing but code and incomplete signal bars, each failure like a silent blow to their hope. Wally stood beside him, arms crossed, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his attempt to seem calm. His foot tapped against the floor almost imperceptibly. An involuntary reflex. Behind the mask, his eyes shifted between the scene and Dick's face, as if searching for some positive sign that never came. The silence, broke by the occasional pop of the radio, began to feel mocking, as if the world itself refused to answer. It was the kind of waiting that made seconds feel like minutes and minutes stretch into hours. Dick kept his gaze fixed on the screen, his fingers repeating sequences of codes known only to a member of the League. Small, secure commands, like passwords whispered in a nearby extinct language he didn't speak, but his posture said it all. If there was anyone alive, anyone even remotely conscious, this would reach them. Wally opened his mouth to say something, but was interrupted by a different sound. A low beep echoed from the console, a sound they hadn't heard in weeks. Both leaned forward on the monitor. A symbol slowly began to take shape, blinking in an irregular pattern. When it finally appeared, Wally held his breath. It was a red arrow. The symbol pulsed on the screen like a heart trying to find its rhythm again. For a moment, neither of them moved, afraid that any motion might erase that fragile connection. It can't be, Wally whispered, his voice barely audible. Dick locked eyes locked on the screen, didn't answer. His thumb hovered over the connection command for a few agonizing seconds. Then, with a single press, the symbol dissolved into static, and the image began to form. Roy Harper's face emerged piece by piece, like a torn photograph being restored pixel by pixel. First, a blurred outline, then washed out colors, and faintly, almost finally, almost clarity. Wally let out a shaky breath when he saw him. Roy was almost unrecognizable, soot covering half his face, a gash on his forehead with the trail of dried blood running down his cheek, his uniform torn in several places, exposing bruised skin, but the eyes still burned with the same intensity as always. Dick felt his chest tighten. Part of him wanted to speak immediately, but the other part simply froze, taking in every detail. Dick, Wally. Roy's voice came with a backdrop of static, weak, almost swallowed by the interference. Still, it carried a weight no distortion could hide. I thought that no one. The silence stretched for a second before Dick managed to reply, his voice steady but low. We're here. We made it. Roy looked away, pressing his lips together as if those words stirred memories he could barely hold back. He took a deep breath, but his voice cracked halfway through. Ollie and Dinah didn't make it. Wally closed his eyes and lowered his head as if trying to hide his expression. Dick just blinked slowly, keeping his eyes on Roy. The weight of those words didn't just hang in the air, it filled it, making the cave feel even denser, colder. Dick took a deep breath, a knot tightening in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too small for the weight of what Roy had just shared. I'm sorry, Roy, he finally said, and the raw sincerity in his voice made even Wally lift his head. Roy nodded slowly, but there was no relief in the gesture. It was more an acknowledgement that between them there was no room for lies or empty promises. Only painful truths. Star cities in ruins, Roy continued, his voice steady only through sheer will. But there are still people alive. A few cops, a few civilians. We're trying to keep order without them. It's almost impossible. Dick closed his eyes for a second, exhaling in a controlled way. When he opened them, he spoke quietly, but with weight. Green Arrow held the line until the very end. If it weren't for him and Canary, the silence and I don't know how to pronounce. The silence lingered, and Wally, eyes fixed on the screen, finished for him. The world would have fallen even faster. Roy didn't answer immediately, but the way his lips trembled said enough. That pain was too familiar to all of them. In that moment, in the space between worlds and the weight they carried, a silent bond reformed. They separated by hundreds of miles, but it felt like they stood side by side, holding each other, but now up, with not strength, but with presence. Wally stepped closer, his hand on Dick's shoulder, and looked at the screen. You're not alone, man. Not anymore. Roy took a deep breath. His image flickered slightly. Then he stood. And you too. What happened with the invasion? Was that you? Nothing good, Dick replied.
But we protected what we could, and we had hope. You're gonna want to hear about that later. Then, as if fate knew the moment needed to be broken before it collapsed under its own weight, a new signal flashed in the corner of the screen. We've got someone else, Dick murmured, leaning in to open the connection. The screen flickered, and Roy's image was pushed into the corner as the new feed slowly opened, static and distortions filling the view. Gradually, the figure of a woman emerged. The face was unmistakable. Zatanna Zatara. Her black uniform was torn in several places. The hat was gone. Her long brown hair fell in disarray all over her shoulders. But what truly stood out were her eyes. Red and swollen, as if crying had been the only constant in recent days. Dick, Wally. Her voice trembled in a way neither of them had ever heard before. She brought one hand to her mouth, as if she needed to confirm they were real. My God, I thought no one else had survived. In contrast with Roy was striking. The contrast with Roy was striking. He was battle-worn, holding his pain behind a hard armor of composure. Zatanna, on the other hand, let every emotional fracture show. Wally, feeling the weight of her gaze, forced a half smile. Hey, Z, I guess we've still got more lives than we should. She let out a laugh, but it was fragile, almost a disguised sob. Where are you? In the Batcave, Dick answered without looking away from her. And you? In San Francisco. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I've got shelter here. The small city is destroyed, but I managed to raise a magical barrier. I don't know how much longer it will hold. It's getting weaker. Dick nodded, it running through possibilities in his mind. As he processed, he noticed something in Zatanna's eyes. Despite all the pain, there was a spark. A small flame stubbornly refusing to go out. It was different from Roy's hardness, but just as necessary. And that's how survivors were made. Completely different in their ways, but always with something inside that refused to die. Are you alone? Dick asked, his voice steady. For a moment, Zatanna looked away. The question seemed simple, but the silence that followed was more eloquent than any immediate answer. She took a breath, and when she looked back at them, her eyes were brimming with fresh tears. Yes, she whispered, but not by choice. The Batcave felt quieter. Even Roy in the corner of the screen tilted his head, listening. Everyone else, Zatanna's voice broke. They either fell or just vanished. Since that day, I've been doing what I can, but I can use the illusions to throw off patrols. I reinforce the barrier when the magic fades. I create enchanted food. But she bit her lip, hesitating. There are children here, sick, families. Dick, there are children here, Dick. Families, they look at me like I can save all of them. I'm not sure I can. Wally swallowed hard. You can't, Z. She gave another laugh, this one without humor. I try to believe that. Sometimes it works, other times it feels like I'm just delaying the inevitable. Roy leaned closer to the camera, his expressions hard. Delaying the inevitable is still resisting. Sometimes that's all we need until help comes. The words hung in the air, heavy but not cold. Dick absorbed them in silence, watching Zatanna as if weighing not just her situation, but the strength she still carried. It was strange. Each of them had survived in completely different ways. Roy through physical resilience and emotional steel, Zatanna through quiet obstinacy and a broken but still living faith. In that moment, Dick realized that despite their differences, they were all fighting for the same thing. Wally cleared his throat, trying to stay functional. You're not going to stay alone. We will find a way. Keep in touch. Reorganize. Zatanna let out a humorless laugh. Reorganize? Wally, the entire league, all the pillars, they're gone. I know, Revan said, his eyes locked on the screen. But it's not just the league that matters now. It's what's left. Zatanna took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady, but the tremors was still there. I don't know if I can. My father is dead. Wally straightened, unsure if he'd heard her right. Zatara? She nodded slowly, pressing her lips together to keep her emotions in check. He helped to protect the shelter until the last second. He used everything he had to hold the magic, to keep the creatures away. Her breath shook. When the barrier he raised started to break, he looked at me and smiled, said he was proud, and her voice cracked, forcing her to swallow the sob. And he asked me to live. Dick kept his eyes on her, saying nothing at first. It wasn't just empathy, it was recognition. He knew the weight of losing someone who guided more than just your path as a hero. He believed in you until the very end, Z, he said firmly, and you're honoring that. Zatanna inhaled deeply, not answering right away. When she did, her voice was lower. That, and because of that, I wonder if I'm strong enough for this. But it's all I have left to keep going. Roy looked away as if Zatanna's pain was something he also knew too well. Wally, on the other hand, forced a small smile. If that's what he wanted, then we'll make sure it was worth it. For a few seconds, silence reigned. Not empty silence, a silence of respect. Roy spoke again. Dick, are you going to take the lead? The question hung in the air, heavy, loaded with meaning. Dick looked away for a moment, as if the shadows of the cave were easier to face than the question. When he finally answered, his voice was controlled, but carried a weight that couldn't be hidden. No, I'm not going to take the lead, but someone has to do something. Zatanna watched him through the screen, and for a moment, the boy she knew seemed different. Harder, more distant. And you think you can be that someone? She asked, not as a challenge, but as if she wanted to be sure. It doesn't matter what I think. Dick straightened his back. The cave is still operational. We will have technology. Remote bases. What's left can be rebuilt. But it won't be quick. Or pretty. Wally glanced sideways at him, his voice tight. And if no one else shows up? Dick took a deep breath before answering. Then we work with who's left. The terminal began blinking with a few new signals. Anonymous transmissions, fragments of voices, broken coordinates, echoes of a world trying to connect again. Roy let out a breath. 3 heroes talking to ghost signals in a dark cave. This should be the start of a joke. Zatanna managed a faint smile. Only if the joke has a happy ending. Doubt it, Dick shook his head. But maybe it can be a new beginning. That's when a weak yet clear voice broke the silence. A new beginning is all we need. Dick and Wally turned at the same time. Midoriya was awake, propped up on one elbow on the cot. His face was pale, with the exhaustion plain to see, but his eyes were steady. I don't know how I ended up here, he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. If you're willing to fight, so am I. Wally shot Dick a quick look, and a tired smile appeared on his face. Welcome to the mess, hero. Dick crossed his arms, allowing himself to a faint smirk. Then we're 4. 5 if we count Roy. Zatanna, on the other side of the screen, discreetly wiped away a tear and nodded. Maybe we can still start something. The terminal beeped again, with distant signals, but no one turned toward it. In that moment, the number was small, the hope fragile. But the next step was set. There among ruins and ghosts, they knew. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And that was the end of chapter 5, Between Ghosts and Promises, part 1 and 2. Sorry if in part 2 I sound a bit distracted and stuff and got a couple things wrong when I was reading. I was thinking of other stuff and I also had something playing on my headphones so that I wouldn't feel too boring while reading, because I don't know why, but I probably have something undiagnosed. Yeah, I must probably have some undiagnosed shit. So yeah, I got distracted a bit in middle of reading while I was still reading and stuff. But I was kind of slower at reading, so sorry if but I will try to see if I can speed that up and that stuff. So yeah, check the author out. This was the end of part 1 and part 2 of chapter 5, Between Ghosts and Promises, of After the Fall, written by Innocent with one N underscore reader. And hope to see you guys in the next one. And yeah, subscribe if you wanna, I don't know, keep up with this. For now, for what I'm thinking of, it's double up. Gonna be doing double up. I will be doing double uploads Tuesday. I'll be posting Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday for the foreseeable future with double uploads each day. Yeah, but depending on how many series I'm working on, I might do a double upload on Saturdays. But yeah, now just see you in the next one and bye.